Hello, and welcome to the podcast's Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. And for those of you who love our Bible and Beyond podcasts, would you please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page? Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at any level just right for you. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
Today, we're going to talk about a word most people have probably never heard of, but I think you'll find it fascinating. The word is palimpsest, which is some ancient writing that has been covered up by later writing. It's exciting to find a palimpsest because it means we're finding even more ancient writings than the ones we thought we had. And there was such a discovery that made the news recently. So this seems like a great time to talk about it. Happily, we found just the right scholar to talk about this. So I want to introduce to you Dr. Jeremiah Coogan. He's assistant professor of New Testament at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, and he earned his PhD in Christianity and Judaism in Antiquity from the University of Notre Dame. He's been very busy publishing scholarly journal articles, and his new book, Eusebius the Evangelist, published by Oxford University Press, won a couple of international prizes. You've been incredibly busy, I think. Anyway, his research focuses on gospel reading, manuscripts, and early Christian philology, or basically textual scholarship, which is exactly why we're so eager to talk to you today. So welcome, Jeremiah.
Thanks so much for having me on.
It's going to be a lot of fun to talk about this with you. So do you mind? I think we sort of need to start off with, that item in the news recently, but we've also got to make sure we understand the vocabulary and what we're talking about. So we've heard that maybe the oldest manuscript of the New Testament in the modern world that we know of anyway has been discovered. And so would you help us unpack the meaning and significance of the news by starting with some really basic questions? Like, for example, what is a manuscript itself? What does that mean?
Yeah, so a manuscript is just a handwritten text. It's written with the hand, manus, hand, and then script, writing.
Okay.
So a manuscript is just a handwritten text.
Okay.
Which is, of course, what all texts were prior to the invention of printing.
Okay, well, that's helpful. So then what was this discovery then about this old manuscript?
Yeah, so this manuscript that's recently been discovered is, in fact, not the oldest New Testament manuscript we have. It dates from the 6th century. So we have quite a few other manuscripts that are older than it.
Okay.
But it is a really fantastic example of a particular kind of manuscript, a palimpsest. As we already said, a palimpsest is a manuscript that's been overwritten. And the word itself reflects the scraping off or the erasing, the rubbing out of the first layer of text, so then a new text can be written on top. So a palimpsest is a text that's been rubbed smooth so it can be rewritten. Now, sometimes, in fact, palimpsests aren't rubbed out. Sometimes they're erased with chemical reagents or otherwise sort of cleaned off so that then there's a fresh surface to write on again. But what we're talking about is the undertext, the text that got erased but not completely erased, that then has been written over on top. And so the work then is to discover those underneath texts, that what we call undertexts, and to then see if we can read them.
So that sounds like it's impossible to read them, but but I guess you've got your ways of doing this. But I guess my other question then would be, if they were just covered up, does that mean that people just thought they weren't so important anymore?
Perhaps sometimes that's what caused palimpsesting, but more often the reason things get palimpsested, the reason they get erased and rewritten, is because they are duplicates, they're spares. If writing material, especially in this case parchment or animal skin, is a relatively rare commodity, or at least a relatively expensive commodity, if you have 3 copies of one book and you need to write a new book, well, you have in your library the raw material to make a new book, and you don't necessarily lose the text that you have. Now, sometimes it is the case that things get erased because they're not considered important. But more often, the texts that get recycled in this way are texts we have lots and lots of copies of. And if you have extras in the library, those are the place you go.
Okay, all right. So, okay, that makes sense then. But have you ever seen like the original manuscripts that authors of Gospels wrote? I mean, does anybody have these texts?
No, and we wish we did, but no scholar today has seen the first copies of any New Testament text. Instead, what we have are copies. Some of our copies are very old, but we're always dealing with copies.
Well, if they're copies, then but they're not like a printing press copy. What's the difference?
Right, yeah, so they're handwritten copies. Someone looks at a text and copies it out. Now, I should say, actually, the way printing worked until very recently was also this kind of human-involved copying. And even today with digital technologies, the things we print and things that are produced either as electronic texts or as books are still made by people. And so with print, somebody has to set up the printing press and they can make mistakes as they do it. With manuscripts, someone has to do the copying and they can make mistakes as they do it. And so certainly manuscripts often, always involve some degree of human error, but that's also just true for texts. Textual transmission always involves a human component.
Which means that somebody could be making mistakes, or could they even add or subtract things that they want?
They could, although oftentimes, maybe the best way to describe this is, generally we have sort of social constraints on what we do. Copyists of ancient texts had social constraints on what a copyist was thought to be allowed to do, things that are within the domain of appropriate copying. And so certainly we have error, and every once in a while we have people correcting things that are in fact not errors. They think, oh, that word is misspelled, and they fix it. And sometimes they fix it wrong. But we generally don't have a wholesale rewriting in the process of copying manuscripts, because that's just not what the work of making a copy was.
That's interesting. Okay. Well then, okay, let's go back then. How old are the earliest New Testament gospel manuscripts that we do have in history?
Yeah. So our first manuscripts date from maybe the 2nd century, or at least by the 3rd. The problem with dating any ancient text is that texts seldom come with date labels attached. And so we have to date them instead based on the handwriting or based on what we call provenance. Where are they found? Are they found in a find with a whole bunch of other 2nd century things? Things that do have dates, like tax records. Tax receipts are great because ancient tax receipts do come with dates. I paid my taxes for the year, and therefore it has a date. And that's how we judge the handwriting. We work from dated examples, things like tax receipts or land contracts or someone doing their census registration for the year, and those things get dated. Literary texts, things like the Gospels or like Homer, don't come with dates attached. And so we're always doing the sort of work of approximation, looking, so this handwriting looks like that handwriting. And sometimes we're working from archaeological evidence. This is found in a layer of things that are all from the 2nd century, the 3rd century, or whenever. Those are the kinds of evidence we have to work with. What that means, though, is that we probably have 2nd century, we certainly have 3rd century copies of New Testament manuscripts, including Gospels. We don't have 1st century examples. And anything we say is 2nd century, well, it very plausibly could be. We have a handful of these. But they also quite plausibly could be 3rd century or even 4th century, because there's just a degree of imprecision here. They don't have date labels, and so we're working with informed, careful judgment that still has a degree of uncertainty.
That's interesting how you use those tax receipts and so forth to get dates. How do you go about finding them in the first place? Do scholars go to some kind of archaeological site and just start digging, or what do you do to find them?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways we have ancient manuscripts.
Okay.
One way is archaeological, although today most people go and look in a library at stuff that's already been excavated rather than going out and digging anew. There's more stuff that has been excavated that still needs to be studied carefully by scholars. There's an enormous amount of material that's in libraries and museums and special collections and still needs careful scholarly study, often slow and painstaking work, because ancient manuscripts aren't always found intact in full page size pieces. Sometimes they're postage stamps or smaller, and then it's just a lot of patient work to put the pieces together. Sometimes we're fortunate, we find things that are much more physically intact, but that's rare. a lot of what we have to work with, what's now often in museums and libraries, comes from ancient Egypt, at least when we're talking about the ancient Mediterranean world. And the reason for that is that Egypt has dry sand. And it doesn't rain a lot. The Nile floods. Anything within the limits of where the Nile floods was A, getting farmed, and so it was always being sort of turned under by plows and other agricultural methods, and B, it gets wet, and so it rots.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond the flood limit of the Nile is where you'd put things like a city dump, or also burial sites and graveyards. And these are the sorts of places where we do find manuscripts. The sand is dry. It has a high silica component to it, which desiccates, dries out manuscripts. The do not eat this packets that come in things you buy from Amazon are silica, and they extract the moisture and put it in a sort of crystalline form and keep things dry. Sand works more or less the same way. It has silicates that sort of draw the moisture out. And so the result of that is that we have lots of stuff that got really dry and stayed in sand in Egypt. And a lot of that material is now being studied by scholars. Most of our physical copies of really early Christian manuscripts come from Egypt, not because there were more Christian books or more Christian readers in Egypt, but because Egypt has these kinds of archaeological sites where it's dry, things haven't rotted, and so we can dig them up. The more rain you get, the fewer books you have.
Yeah. So what about you personally? Have you been to those sites to find things, or do you work in a library? Like, what do you do for your work?
Yeah, I unfortunately have never had the opportunity to go and see any of these sites in Egypt. I would love to, but that has not happened at this point in my life. I've spent a good bit of time working with a number of papyrus collections that are held in a number of different libraries. So especially at the University of Oxford, where I used to work, there's this massive collection called the Oxyrhynchus papyri, excavated from the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, transported through colonial expropriation to mostly the University of Oxford, and then a number of other libraries have little bits of this larger find. And I've worked a great deal with that collection, which includes both papyrus, so plant matter that's been turned into writing surface, and also some parchment. We're talking about palimpsest, though. Erased and recycled manuscripts, we're almost always talking about parchment, because papyrus, plant matter, doesn't erase well. Animal skin erases much better. And so really, when we're talking about palimpsest, we're almost always talking about animal skins.
Oh, that's so interesting to hear. Oh my goodness. So you actually work with those, you look at those, do you touch them, or how do you actually work with them? That's interesting.
Yeah, so they have to be touched by someone to be conserved, but part of the conservation process is generally to mount them between glass or various kinds of plastic that protect them. That way, they're not always getting touched by fingers, they're not getting bent and shaken. Unfortunately, if you're dealing with the postage stamp situation, which oftentimes we are, those pieces you actually have to sort of move around. And so that, as part of the process of conservation and also reconstruction, are often worked with as loose pieces. But then the goal is that you figure out where the pieces go and you mount it and you stabilize it in a way that it's more shelf stable, easier to study for others, but also just physically better preserved.
Yeah, interesting. All right. So then in the news, I think we learned that someone discovered a manuscript of a part of the Gospel of Matthew that's older than anything else we've seen in the modern world. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so this is a piece of parchment, animal skin, that was rewritten not just once, but twice with later texts. The first layer, the underlayer that's Matthew, is written in Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic. It was one of the most widely used languages of the ancient Middle East and Central Asia. That text was written probably in the 6th century. Then, on top of it, it was erased and a Greek text was written on top of it. Even later, that Greek text was erased and a Georgian text was written on top of that. The physical object we're talking about is held at the Vatican, but the larger manuscript it comes from is held at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. And so this undertext, the bottom layer, the Syriac layer, and the animal skin come from the 6th century. That means they're not the earliest physical manuscript. But what's interesting about this manuscript is that it contains what we call the Old Syriac translation of the Gospels. The Gospels were written in Greek, but they were translated by the late 2nd or early 3rd century into Latin, into Syriac, probably slightly later than that, into Coptic, and then going forward in history into a number of other languages as well. But the Latin and the Syriac translations of the Greek New Testament are the first translations that took place. This Syriac translation, this first Syriac translation from Greek into Syriac, took place, again, probably at the end of the second or beginning of the third century. Again, it doesn't come with a date, so we're working from sort of limited evidence, but we know roughly when it would have taken place. What that means is the Old Syriac, even in a 6th century manuscript, gives us a kind of evidence for what the text was that was being translated in the late 2nd or early 3rd century. It gives us a window into what the text of some Greek copy of Matthew would have looked like around the year 200, again, taking that date with a real grain of salt. But it gives us an early window into the text of Matthew that's much older than the physical manuscript we're talking about.
Okay, so let me see if I got you here. I didn't know there were so many languages involved in just reading the Bible. But you're saying that it was written in Greek, translated into Syriac, but we're reading it in Greek. How did that happen?
No, we're what we're talking about, we're still reading in Syriac. So this 6th century manuscript is still in Syriac. Now, most modern translations used today are made from the Greek New Testament, and these kinds of Syriac translations can help us reconstruct the history of the Greek text. But what we're talking about is a 6th century Syriac manuscript from a late 2nd or early 3rd century translation from Greek into Syriac.
And maybe tell us a little bit more about why would Syriac be important to us now then?
Yeah. Well, so there are a couple of different kinds of reasons. One, both historically and even in the present, there have been Syriac speaking and Syriac worshiping Christians. And so the Syriac New Testament, including the Syriac Gospels, have been an important part of how many Christians for almost 2,000 years have worshipped and read Scripture. That's one reason. Another reason is what we call text critical or textual criticism. That is, the translation from Greek into Syriac gives a sort of snapshot of what the Greek text was at a very early period. And so it gives another kind of evidence for people who are studying the history of the Greek text of the Gospels and who are interested in understanding the earliest written forms of the Gospels. And
Wow.
both of those reasons are important, and I think they can sort of work together as different aspects of why we're interested in this manuscript.
All right, now I want to ask you a question that's probably a little bit off subject, but I think it'll help us follow your whole argument in terms of languages and why they're important. But there's a controversy I keep hearing about that there's such a thing as a Lamsa Bible. Some say that it came from an Aramaic source that was Jesus's own language, so it was before the Greek versions. And yet there's controversy about this. And I guess the issue is that this Lamsa version talks about Jesus quoting Psalm 22 on the cross in a different way than what we see in the Greek translations. Can you tell us about that? I mean, where did that come from, and how much truth is in there?
Yeah, so this is mostly a modern scholarly fiction. What we're talking about here is what's called the Lamsa Bible, which is a 1933 printed edition, which then has gotten reprinted lots of times, of what's actually just one of the standard Bible translations in Syriac. So far today, we've been talking about the Old Syriac, the first translation from Greek into Syriac.
Okay.
Well, some readers, a couple hundred years later, thought that the Old Syriac wasn't quite precise enough. It wasn't quite linguistically careful enough in how it rendered the Greek. And so they made a revised translation in Syriac, still from Greek into Syriac, that we called the Peshitta. And that was the main biblical translation that circulated in Syriac from roughly the beginning of the 5th century right up until the present. The Lamsa Bible is just a printed edition of the Peshitta, which means it's important as a witness to the way that many Christian readers in the Syriac tradition and then in sort of adjacent Christian traditions have encountered the Bible for 1,500 years. But it's not a text that precedes the Greek New Testament. All of our New Testament Gospels were written in Greek. And while Jesus did speak a kind of Aramaic, the kind of Aramaic he spoke wasn't the same thing as the Syriac that these texts are written in. Jewish Palestinian Aramaic of the Roman period was a quite different language than the Mesopotamian Aramaic that we know as Syriac, which many subsequent Christians spoke and read in. And so this is just a modern confusion. We really like the idea of having the original Aramaic words of Jesus. And so we've said, this is an Aramaic thing, and that must have been an Aramaic thing, so these must be the same thing. And that's not true.
Okay.
We're still really just talking about translations of the Greek New Testament.
That's really helpful. Thank you for sort of putting that to bed for us so we can have a little bit of more of a scholarly view of this. This is really helpful. Okay, so now I think we're ready to understand a little bit more of your own research, which is fascinating. So you're in Hamburg, Germany right now, and I understand that you're studying some early manuscript prefaces to the Gospels in several ancient languages. So can you first of all tell us what a preface is and what you're looking for?
Yeah. So many readers of the Bible today will have a study Bible that has an introductory paragraph or two or three or maybe more that
Yeah,
says where the text was written, what kind of text it is, maybe some of the major scholarly or theological conversations around that text. Study Bibles today have these.
right.
Well, ancient Christian Bibles written as manuscripts also had these kinds of tools for readers.
Oh,
One of these is the preface, that sort of introductory text that guides you into how to understand a text, to understand its context, its history, its significance, things like that. And my project that I'm working on is part of a larger project that's preparing a facing page edition and translation, so original language text and then translated English text with lots of notes of a number of early Christian gospel prefaces in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, in Armenian, in Gothic, in Coptic, and in Ethiopic. So a range of early Christian languages,
wow.
dating up to about the year 800 CE. So for the first 800 years of the Christian tradition, what kinds of introductory tools for readers do we find? What questions do these tools seek to answer? What ways of reading gospel texts do they invite readers to participate in? And how do they agree and disagree with each other? So it's an invitation to think about how past readers encountered the gospels, the questions they were asking, the kinds of answers they were finding. And also offers through that a way of thinking about the modern questions we ask, often the same kinds of questions, and maybe helps us to think about those questions that we ask as modern readers in fruitful ways.
So you listing all those languages. Honestly, Jeremiah, how many languages can you read? That's incredible.
It sort of depends on how you count,
Okay.
but I read about 20 languages. Some of them I spend more time with, some of them I spend a little bit less time with, but I read about 20 ancient languages. And it's one of the great things that's fun about my field, actually, the opportunity to keep learning new languages, to keep exploring new aspects of the history of biblical texts. So it's one of the things I greatly enjoy about this career.
That's rather phenomenal right there. But okay, so very interesting. So one of the major reasons that we care so much about these early manuscripts is that they show us that they've been rewritten for new readers along the way. So what conclusions would you draw from these prefaces that you've been studying?
Yeah. Well, so there are a couple of different directions I could take this. One aspect is that we find that early readers, just like modern readers, often disagreed about things.
Okay.
And so this project gives a sort of broad cross section of different ways that readers were encountering texts and puzzling over the same texts in often quite different ways. And I think that evidence of a kind of diversity in the Christian reading tradition, that different readers across time have encountered these texts and have done different things with them, is important. I also think it's fruitful to note that they're often asking questions that we might think are just sort of modern and critical questions.
Mhm.
Questions like, when was this text written? Who's the actual author? What was the context that prompted writing it? And so forth. Those are kinds of questions that you might find in a modern New Testament classroom.
Yeah.
And sometimes people sort of say, well, those are just modern questions, and ancient readers were more interested in theology. And I think that that whole division sort of doesn't hold up when you look at how readers in the past were interested in both theological and sort of critical historical questions when it came to their texts.
So, are you surprised by anything you've been learning? Like, when you're searching around, are you looking for something in particular, or tell us a little bit about your own discoveries?
Yeah, so a great deal of the work I'm doing right now is looking at manuscripts that have been imperfectly or sort of insufficiently described. And they'll sometimes have this descriptor in a catalog entry that's something like miscellanea argumenta, sort of random prefaces.
Okay.
What that actually means is that nobody has bothered to, no one has taken the time to figure out what's actually going on there. They're just like, here's another preface, I'm done, we're good. And so right now, a lot of what I'm doing is I'm looking at Ethiopic and Armenian texts and asking the question, so what actually is in here? These are gospel manuscripts, but they have prefaces and other kinds of sort of introductory material to help the reader on their way. Again, think about a modern study Bible. It's an ancient equivalent of this kind of project. And so I'm trying to sort out, first of all, just what are we actually talking about? Some prefaces are well known. Scholars know a handful of them pretty well, and they're often part of scholarly discussions. Many others, not so much, or they haven't really properly been edited and translated. And so one of the things I'm doing is just trying to sort out what's going on in these gospel manuscripts.
Yeah. So in our website, we've been talking a lot about extra canonical types of writings. Are you specifically looking at the 4 Gospels in the New Testament canon, or do you wander outside, or what is your relationship to all the different kinds of Gospels that are out there?
Yeah. So the kinds of prefaces I'm working with, we only happen to have for the 4 Gospels that become part of the Christian New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
If we had similar prefaces for other texts from the period I'm looking at, again, up to about the year 800, because after that, there's more, but one person in one project can only do so much. So in the period I'm looking at, the first 800 years or so, we don't have similar prefaces for other gospel-like texts. If we had them, I would love to include them, but we don't.
That's interesting.
But, as a related point to that, though, oftentimes the ways of reading, the sort of interpretive moves that we find in these prefaces, intersect with non-canonical gospel traditions and non-canonical texts. And so even though these particular kinds of prefaces, as best I've discovered so far, only exist in the period of late antiquity, this period up to about 800, only exist for the 4 New Testament Gospels, they're still in a bibliographic, a literary world that intersects with other texts, including non-canonical texts. And so just because these prefaces are being made sort of around the 4 Gospels of the Christian New Testament, it doesn't mean that all other kinds of gospel narratives are completely separate in a different universe. There's often a bit of connection there.
Oh, okay, that's helpful. Now, do you want to offer any maybe final suggestions to our listeners to what they should look for, or maybe how to think about the translations they're using now?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really big question. It's a good question. There are a lot of modern translations, and most of them are really very good. Some of them less so, but most of them are very good. And the differences between them are often vanishingly small and look more like reasons to avoid copyright complaints than anything else. So rather than sort of puzzling over, do I have the very best translation? I think that if modern readers are interested in understanding biblical texts better, I would suggest the practice of reading over the shoulders of past readers from the Christian tradition. That is to say, take a look at ancient commentaries or ancient homilies, ancient sermons, which actually give us a window into how past readers understood these texts. The great thing about reading with past readers is that they notice different things. They're worried about different things. They're grumpy about different things than modern readers might be. And this is a way that sort of this is a way of reading that expands our own appreciation of and understanding of these texts.
Well, now, do
A
we
lot
need
of
to
these kinds of texts.
I'm sorry, do we need to read them in these foreign languages, or is this available in English?
A lot of these kinds of texts have been translated into English. There's more work to be done. I'm sure one could spend many lifetimes translating cool early Christian texts, but a lot of these resources have been translated into English. And a lot of them are actually free online, and others are available in reasonably priced printed translations. But yeah, I would say if you want to sort of have a richer understanding of biblical texts, read over the shoulder of past readers.
That's wonderful. Gosh, it's been fun to talk to you. Do you have any final suggestions as to how we understand the whole world of these ancient texts and what we should be doing about it besides reading over the shoulders of somebody else?
Yeah. Well, I mean, coming back to the palimpsest that prompted our whole conversation today.
Yeah.
I think we sometimes get really excited about things that are the oldest.
Yes, right.
And I can understand that. It is cool to find old stuff. But I think also whenever someone tells you, especially in a news story, X is the oldest something, read really carefully what exactly makes it the oldest, and is the oldest of what.
Okay.
The best way to get a news story out there is to say, I found the oldest thing of whatever thing that is. But oftentimes it takes like 4 asterisks to make the thing you want to talk about actually the oldest thing. And so if you see in the news that something is the oldest thing, you should be really skeptical and figure out what exactly it is that makes it older than what else. Because quite often, and people who report news stories often don't know enough about ancient anything to be able to figure out, well, how important is this oldest example of whatever it is? Or what exactly makes it the oldest what? And so here's a great example where it's a really, really cool manuscript that is an example of a really ancient and important textual tradition. And also, it gets reported in ways that are not exactly true, or at least that will easily confuse you. So yeah, if someone tells you something's the oldest, be careful.
That's just great. Boy, it's been so much fun to talk to you, Jeremiah. I really appreciate your taking us onto this deep dive that most of us will never do. I doubt that most of us speak any more than 1 or 2 or 3 languages. So it's really fun to talk to you about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode from the show notes on the website, earlychristiantexts.com. Or just come browse around on the website to find all the other resources provided for you there. Also, we ask for your support to keep producing these podcast interviews. Please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page at patreon.com/BibleandBeyond. And we love hearing from you on the Facebook page at Early Christian Texts or Twitter at EarlyXIAN Texts. Be sure to come back next month for our next episode on Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond.